The glimmering lights of Manhattan's skyline reflected across the polished glass walls of the Martin and Kruger International headquarters. The building itself was a monolith of success and opulence, a testament to the commanding presence of William Kruger III, the billionaire CEO renowned for his unyielding ambition, ruthless business tactics, and penchant for flaunting his status. At 42, he had already eclipsed every rival in the tech industry, cornering markets in cloud computing, biomedical intelligence, and cutting-edge cybersecurity solutions. But anyone in the know understood that underneath the polished veneer of philanthropic interviews and lavish charity galas lay a core as cold and immovable as stone. Long after most employees had filtered out into the bustling streets beneath, a solitary figure mopped the marble floors of the executive corridor. This was Aurora Rory Madrigal, a 26-year-old Filipina janitor who had come to the United States 4 years prior. She stood at average height and possessed an unassuming air, but her eyes, soft and brown, sparkled with quiet determination whenever she spoke of home or her dreams. She took pride in her work, no matter how humble it seemed, as every paycheck she earned sent her younger sister through college back in Manila. On the surface, Aurora appeared meek and reserved. She was polite to everyone, from the mailroom interns to the board of directors who zipped by in crisp business suits, and she kept her head down. What few suspected, what no one in the Martin and Kruger building had ever imagined, was that Aurora carried within her a passion she had cultivated from early childhood. She had been a dancer almost as soon as she could walk. Her mother was a country schoolteacher, and her father had once been a folk dance instructor who traveled across the Philippine Islands, introducing traditional dances to local communities. He had taught Aurora everything from the tinkling to the intricacies of modern jazz and ballet, nurturing a grace that seemed at odds with her subdued personality. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Aurora dipped her mop into soapy water, her mind drifting to the small dance studio she used to frequent back in Manila. Despite her mother's protest that dancing would never put food on the table, Aurora's father insisted on making her dancing shoes a part of the family budget. "She has something special," he would say, "something that lights up her face when the music begins." But since arriving in the United States on a work visa, Aurora had found her days too consumed by survival. Her dream, chasing auditions, landing a spot with a dance troupe, performing in real venues, remained a distant fantasy overshadowed by rent payments and remittances to family. That night, as Aurora methodically worked to clean the corridor, voices and raucous laughter echoed from the corner office. The door was slightly ajar. She tried not to eavesdrop on her superiors, but it was difficult not to overhear the boisterous conversation. Inside that grand office, a group of executives clinked glasses of expensive champagne. William Kruger III presided over them like a self-appointed monarch, wearing a custom-tailored navy suit that likely cost more than Aurora's annual salary. He had just struck a colossal deal, merging Martin and Kruger with a smaller European robotics firm, an acquisition that would further entrench his position in the global market. The celebration was exclusive. Top-tier managers, a few well-connected investors, and the newly arrived CEO from the European robotics division, a tall, lean man named Dr. Helmut Fischer. At first, Aurora assumed it was just another after-hours business victory party. She tried to move discreetly, careful not to let her presence be known as she wiped the floor near the open door. But then she heard Kruger's voice booming. "Some welcome gift for our friend Helmut. I need to show him just how well we treat our international partners here in the Big Apple." A few of the executives exchanged nervous laughter. Those who knew William Kruger recognized that he was as unpredictable as he was powerful. He snapped his fingers at a junior manager, a red-faced man in his mid-30s. "Give me something," Kruger said with an almost manic glee, "some entertainment to break up this dull talk about synergy and market share, something fun, something Helmut hasn't seen." The junior manager, unsure what to do, stammered, "We could. I mean, we could get someone from the local club, or perhaps we can go downtown if you want to see some nightlife." But Kruger waved his hand dismissively. "That's so unoriginal, we need an in-house spectacle, something unexpected." He cast his gaze around the room until his eyes slid toward the doorway, landing upon Aurora's shadow. The sudden hush signaled that they all noticed her. Aurora felt the hairs at the back of her neck stand upright. She'd been working late many times before, but never had she drawn the direct attention of the CEO. "Hey," Kruger barked, stepping away from the crowd. "You there, you're new, right? The cleaning lady." Aurora froze for a second, collecting herself as she took a step inside the office. "Good evening, sir. I'm Aurora. I've been working here for a few months." Her voice was steady, albeit quiet. A few mild snickers rippled through the tipsy executives, who sipped champagne and surveyed her as if she were an amusing sideshow. Kruger advanced, swirling his own glass with a swagger that radiated arrogance. "You see this?" He gestured to Helmut, who wore a polite, if somewhat detached, expression. "This is one of our newest partners in greatness, Dr. Helmut Fischer. He's traveled far to be here. We want to show him that we know how to have a good time, right, Helmut?" Helmut offered a non-committal nod and forced smile. Aurora caught the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. Perhaps he didn't fully approve of Kruger's flamboyant display, but Helmut was not about to challenge his host in front of everyone. Kruger turned his attention back to Aurora. We're celebrating a big deal, which means everyone in this building tonight gets to be part of the fun, so I'm thinking you can provide a little bit of a show for us. Aurora's cheeks flushed. A show? Had she heard that right? She clutched the handle of her mop, not quite believing he was speaking to her. She had absolutely no intention of performing for a group of intoxicated, high-powered strangers. But the menace in Kruger's half-smile made her swallow her protest. She needed this job. Her visa status was precarious, reliant on continuous employment. Even a whiff of insubordination could threaten her position. Sir, she began carefully, I don't believe that's part of my... Kruger held up a hand. Hold on, I have an idea, he said, turning to one of the executives. Davis, didn't I see some video of staff members at the last holiday party trying to dance? Maybe we'll see what kind of moves our friend here has. She's from the Philippines, right? They must have some interesting dances there. I heard something about bamboo poles and jumping around, or maybe they do those showgirl routines in certain places. Laughter erupted, though some participants laughed more out of fear than genuine amusement. Aurora's cheeks burned. She felt belittled. Tinikling, the folk dance he was referencing, was beautiful and historically significant, not a party trick. Still, she forced a smile, a reflex that concealed the embarrassment crawling up her spine. I do know a few dances, Mr. Kruger, she said softly, hoping that might appease him so she could slip away quickly. But I'm certain there are more professional ways to. Stop talking, Kruger interrupted, not unkindly but with a directness that signaled he was used to absolute obedience. Let's see it then. Do a little jig or something for Dr. Fisher's enjoyment. Consider it a special request from your boss. Her heart pounded. This was humiliating, 1,000 times more so because all eyes were upon her. Some of the executives wore expressions ranging from awkward pity to mild curiosity, but not one of them spoke up to defend her. Their paychecks were far too dependent on Kruger's good graces. Aurora glanced from face to face, feeling the weight of their stares, conscious that if she refused, her livelihood could be in jeopardy. She pressed her lips together, summoning the facade of composure. The memory of her father's gentle voice echoed in her mind. When you dance, dance wholeheartedly, even if your audience is only the wind. But dancing under these circumstances wasn't a performance of joy, it was a coerced spectacle. Still, if she was going to do it, she resolved to do it with dignity. All right, Aurora said, her eyes darting about for any sort of music. I can give a quick demonstration, but I'll need a bit of space. Kruger smirked, stepping back and spreading his arms wide, beckoning the others to retreat. A few confetti ribbons from an earlier toast littered the carpet, and the champagne glasses rattled on the table as Dr. Fisher politely set his glass aside. Aurora inhaled slowly, ignoring the swirl of anxiety in her gut. She rolled her shoulders back. No one turned on any music. The hush was broken only by the distant hum of ventilation. Aurora decided to rely on the internal rhythm that had guided her steps since childhood. If she had to endure this, she would at least do it on her own terms. She began with a simple fluidity in her arms, soft, controlled. Her feet shifted gracefully across the plush carpet, forging a slow, modest pattern as if she were hearing a melodic tune in her head. Despite being forced, despite feeling reduced to a novelty, she found the faint spark of dancing again. Her father's words guided her. Grace is not in the environment, grace is in you. Gradually, she added a bit of flair. She shifted to a style reminiscent of some contemporary pieces she had practiced in Manila. She extended her legs, balancing momentarily in arabesque before pivoting gently. She did not break eye contact with the pattern of the floor for long, but a fleeting glance upward revealed that several onlookers had fallen silent, perhaps taken aback by the transformation of a shy janitor into a poised dancer. The moment was short-lived. Kruger, leaning against the edge of his massive mahogany desk, let out a sudden laugh, a sharp bark that punctured the delicate atmosphere Aurora was weaving. That's all well and good, but come on, we want something with more excitement, he announced, gesturing flamboyantly. Isn't there some sort of exotic, traditional dance you do with big gestures, or maybe something sexy if you're comfortable with that? We're among adults here. Aurora froze, her cheeks now blazing in mortification. Memories of tinikling and traditional folk performances flooded her mind. They were never meant for ridicule or sensual exploitation. They were meant to celebrate culture, history, and pride. She hesitated, but the circle of watchers had grown expectant. She could almost feel them mentally pressuring her to comply with the CEO's demands. All right, she managed, her voice nearly a whisper. She took another calming breath. Fine, she thought. If they wanted exotic, she could show them the tinikling steps, though typically that required bamboo poles and a partner. She improvised, stepping quickly in a side-to-side pattern to mimic the footwork used between the wooden poles. Her arms moved fluidly above her head in a graceful arc. To her own surprise, a subdued but insistent sense of pride welled in her chest. She was Filipina. These steps were part of her heritage. Forced though she was, she would not let them reduce this cultural treasure to a lewd cabaret. Her steps began to pick up speed, and for a moment she could almost imagine the sound of bamboo poles clicking in time. She moved with precision, landing sure-footed on the carpet as if it were the stage of a community hall back in Manila. Two executives, apparently feeling awkward, began to clap along in an offbeat attempt to provide a rhythm. Helmut Fischer watched with a furrowed brow, his arms folded, seemingly unsure whether to be amused or horrified by Kruger's show of power. And Kruger himself, after a short while, seemed to lose interest in the cultural aspect. He took a quick gulp of his champagne and muttered something that made the people nearest to him chuckle. Even so, Aurora danced. She refused to let their mocking stares and half-suppressed grins break her concentration. If they wanted to see her dance, she would do so on her own terms. She remembered how her father had taught her to leap gracefully as the bamboo poles clacked together, crossing quickly with each motion. She allowed her arms to mimic the swoop of birds, the gentle wave of palm fronds under the tropical sun. She refused to reduce her beloved tradition to a half-hearted routine. By the time she concluded, she was breathing heavily, a slight perspiration at her temples. She stopped in the center of the office, feeling a mixture of defiance and shame, longing to vanish into the nearest supply closet. A smattering of applause broke the silence. Some of the executives seemed genuinely impressed, though none dared to show too much empathy or praise, as that might be considered dissent in Kruger's eyes. Kruger himself gave a casual clap, the kind one might give a street performer before dropping $1 in the hat. "Brava, that was entertaining," he said with a crooked smile. "You see, Helmut, this is how we do it in New York. We get everyone involved in the celebrations." Dr. Fischer nodded slightly, but Aurora could tell there was conflict in his eyes. He looked as though he wanted to say something, perhaps apologize, but he swallowed his words. Another round of uncertain laughter eddied through the group, and Aurora caught glimpses of pity in the fleeting gazes directed at her. She forced a nod, then backed out of the room, hoping to never repeat that experience again. Despite her best efforts to put the incident out of her mind, the rumor mill churned fiercely. By the next morning, a handful of employees who had missed the impromptu dance show were whispering about it by the water cooler. A couple of them teased Aurora in passing. One man made a wide grin and pantomimed a step of tinikling when he saw her. But more worrisome was the risk that William Kruger's request might not be a one-time ordeal. Would he start demanding these humiliating performances at corporate parties? Would the higher-ups see her as a court jester of sorts, a novelty to be trotted out? Aurora tried to maintain a low profile, burying herself in her work. She arrived earlier than usual the following days, cleaning offices and corridors before the majority of staff showed up. She found ways to busy herself until well after the last of them left. She struggled to avoid crossing paths with the CEO. But fate had other plans. The next Monday morning, an internal email circulated among certain employees inviting them to a special team-building event that very afternoon. Usually these events were for mid-level managers. Janitorial staff, especially on the contract payroll, were never included. Aurora certainly had no illusions that she'd be on the list, yet to her astonishment she found her name appended at the bottom, Aurora Madrigal Facilities. The email gave no details about the nature of the event, only that attendees were cordially invited to the company's newly renovated multi-purpose auditorium. Aurora felt her stomach twist. Why was she, of all people, invited to a managerial function? She tried to inquire discreetly, but her direct supervisor, an older woman named Denise, shrugged in confusion. "I don't know, hun," Denise said, adjusting her glasses. "Never seen them invite the cleaning crew to these things, but I guess you should show up. If your name on the list, you don't want them thinking you're ignoring a summons." At precisely 2:00 p.m., Aurora mustered her courage and entered the auditorium. Rows of plush seats faced a small stage flanked by screens. Dozens of mid-level managers milled about, chatting in small clusters. A hush fell when William Kruger strode in through the side door, accompanied by Helmut Fischer and a few other high-profile executives. The sense of intimidation was almost tangible as people scrambled to find seats. Aurora attempted to seat herself inconspicuously at the back, but Kruger's eagle eye swept over the room and landed on her almost immediately. He raised a hand, beckoning her closer with a theatrical gesture. Her heart pounded as she made her way down the aisle. A murmur passed among the managers, many of whom recognized her from rumor alone as the dancing janitor. She felt multiple sets of eyes on her, a magnifying glass effect that sharpened her sense of vulnerability. As Aurora reached the front row, Kruger motioned for her to remain standing near the steps that led to the stage. Meanwhile, Dr. Fischer took to the podium, clearing his throat. He introduced himself in that crisp, lightly accented English of his, referencing the success of the acquisition and the bright future of the merged companies. There was polite applause, but the tension was palpable. It was evident something else was about to happen. "Now," Dr. Fischer concluded, stepping aside, "let me turn it over to our esteemed CEO for a special announcement." William Kruger took center stage with the brash confidence of a ringmaster. He shot Aurora a look that sent a jolt of dread through her. Then, facing his assembled managers, he began. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've gathered you here for more than the usual corporate pep talk. We're always on the lookout for ways to break the mold, to keep our company lively and dynamic. We need to stay innovative both in our products and in our culture. Recently, we had an interesting little demonstration. Perhaps some of you have heard that one of our staff members gave us an impromptu performance at an after-hours gathering last week. The crowd murmured, exchanging glances. Aurora's ears burned. In many companies, Kruger continued, employees are stuck in rigid roles. You do your job, you never step out of your lane, and that's that. Here at Martin & Kruger, we celebrate stepping out of boundaries. That's why, he pointed toward Aurora with almost mocking enthusiasm. I want to introduce all of you to Aurora Madrigal, who has proven that hidden talents can be found anywhere, even among our janitorial staff. Aurora's mouth ran dry. She struggled to maintain composure, uncertain of what he was driving at. But she forced a slight nod to the managers, who gave a polite but puzzled round of applause. We all saw Aurora's dance moves, Kruger continued, his voice dripping with a condescending praise that made Aurora's stomach turn. It got me thinking, how many times have we overlooked the hidden skills within our organization? Today we're going to do something special. We're going to have a little dance competition right here, right now. Let's bring some excitement to our Monday, yes. A ripple of confused laughter spread through the auditorium. Dr. Fisher, who sat behind Kruger, looked somewhat amused but also uncertain. Aurora's dread deepened. A dance competition orchestrated by the CEO himself in front of half the management staff. This was no mere team-building event. This was an exhibit of his power, of how he could force his employees to jump through hoops for his amusement. Now don't get shy, Kruger went on, practically relishing the manager's discomfort. I'll pick a few volunteers to come up, and Aurora here will show us the ropes, maybe teach a few steps. Consider it a bonding experience. The winner might just get a nice bonus in their paycheck, or maybe a promotion, we'll see. The mention of a potential bonus or promotion caused a stir of reluctant excitement among the managers. Aurora felt her grip tighten on the small notebook she carried. This was not the environment she wanted for dancing. It wasn't about joy or expression, it was a twisted game. She flicked a glance at Dr. Fisher, silently pleading for him to intervene, but he merely watched, lips pressed thin in some mixture of polite compliance and professional curiosity. One by one, Kruger singled out a handful of managers, some of whom were known for their easygoing personalities, others who were rumored to be on the CEO's short list for promotions. They filed onto the stage, forced smiles plastered on their faces. Aurora stood among them, her pulse roaring in her ears. Kruger gave a grand sweep of his hand. Aurora, my dear, why don't you start us off with something energetic? Show them your moves, then we'll get each manager to try and replicate it. Aurora took a trembling breath. She knew better than to refuse. Clenching her fists, she nodded. Yes, sir, she said softly. This was no place for personal pride. She had bills to pay, a sister in college, and everything hinged on maintaining this job. She would go through with his charade, she would dance. She asked for a bit of music this time, hoping the presence of an actual beat might make the situation less humiliating. Kruger obliged with an impatient nod to a nearby technician who quickly tapped at a control panel. A canned pop track with a decent tempo blared through the speakers. Aurora closed her eyes for a moment, summoning the mental image of a small dance studio in Manila, remembering the feeling of freedom her father's lessons had once given her. When the beat kicked in, Aurora started moving. The stage lights were bright, but she willed herself to block out the lines of seats filled with curious onlookers. She added a bit of hip-hop flair to some basic steps, trying to keep the routine simple enough that others might follow. She popped her shoulders in time with the beat, slid her feet to the side with a gentle swagger, then threw in a quick spin. The crowd gasped, impressed by her fluidity. Even the managers on stage struggled to keep up with her sharp transitions. In that moment, a flicker of real enjoyment ignited inside her. If only the circumstances were different, if only she weren't performing like a court jester for the CEO's twisted sense of humor, maybe she could relish this. As it was, she ended the demonstration with a final step forward, breathing more heavily than expected. The auditorium erupted in applause, and Aurora offered a slight bow, her face flushed. Kruger smirked and turned to the managers. All right, folks, you saw that, now let's see if you can keep up. One by one, the managers made clumsy attempts to replicate Aurora's routine. Some were stiff and awkward, others tried humming it up for comedic effect. The room filled with laughter, some good-natured, some forced. On the surface, it seemed like a harmless, playful corporate bonding exercise, but Aurora noticed the way Kruger watched them. She recognized the self-satisfied gleam in his eye. He was enjoying the knowledge that he could coerce these professionals into making fools of themselves. She was merely the catalyst for his twisted amusement. They continued for nearly half an hour, with different managers stepping forward to try new moves. Aurora was compelled to demonstrate again and again, shifting between styles. She glimpsed Dr. Fisher occasionally leaning in to speak quietly to Kruger, but the CEO merely nodded dismissively. The show would go on as he pleased. Eventually, Kruger called a halt. The managers stepped down from the stage, panting, some of them exchanging high fives or self-conscious grins. Kruger climbed the steps to address the audience. Well, that was educational, he said, raising his eyebrows with theatrical exaggeration. And it just proves that we have hidden talents in unexpected places. I can't say all of you will be auditioning for Broadway anytime soon, but at least you tried. A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd. He paused, let the silence build. Then he added, now I think it's only fair to say that the best dancer up there besides Aurora was, he scanned the front row. Let's go with Lionel Zhang. He pointed to a junior manager who had indeed shown some rhythm. Lionel's face lit up and he received a solid round of applause. You might find a little something extra in your next paycheck, Lionel. Another polite wave of applause followed. Lionel, blinking in disbelief, thanked Kruger profusely. The crowd settled, waiting for the final word, but Kruger's eyes drifted back to Aurora. As for Aurora, he said, savoring the moment, she's been an outstanding sport, letting us see her hidden side, so let's not forget to give her some love as well. He gestured to the audience, prompting a second round of applause. Aurora forced a smile, though inside she wanted nothing more than to run from the stage. But Kruger added, that half-mocking grin returning to his lips, I know some of you might be thinking, why are we praising a janitor? Shouldn't we hold ourselves to higher standards? The question hung in the air, shocking the crowd into an uneasy muttering. Aurora felt a cold sweat bead on her brow. Kruger let the tension sit for a heartbeat longer, then continued. Well, let me tell you something. If a janitor can stand up here and perform better than half our managerial staff, then maybe we all have a little something to learn from each other. Keep your minds open. That's the Martin and Kruger way. The audience, unsure how to respond, gave a muted applause, and that signaled the end of the team-building event. People began filing out with dazed expressions, uncertain whether they had just witnessed a genuine attempt at bridging corporate hierarchies or a demonstration of Kruger's controlling theatrics. Aurora stood off to the side, her stomach in knots, as the CEO stepped down from the stage and headed for the exit in a swirl of high-ranking executives. Just before he left, Dr. Fisher gave Aurora a gentle pat on the shoulder and whispered, "Good job." Then he was gone, following his new business partner out of the auditorium. Alone under the stage lights, Aurora allowed herself a trembling exhale. What had she just become a part of? The next few weeks were a blur. People recognized her in the cafeteria, in the hallways, some offering kind words about her dancing. A few tried to strike up conversations, asking if she had any formal training. But beneath the surface, Aurora sensed an uncomfortable fascination with her, a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and from some outright condescension. Rumors spread about how the CEO liked her as a novelty or that she might be invited to future events. She wanted nothing more than to revert to anonymity, yet her attempts to keep her head down only intensified the rumor mill. Strangely, her humiliating predicament brought her into contact with managers who never would have given her a second glance otherwise. A petite woman from HR discreetly asked Aurora if she'd be interested in auditioning for a local dance troupe. A software engineer pulled her aside and admitted he found Kruger's behavior nauseating but didn't dare speak out. In these quiet, supportive moments, Aurora felt the sting of her public ordeal soften, if only slightly. The real trouble began when a video clip of Aurora's performance in the auditorium surfaced on social media. One of the managers had recorded a segment on his phone, just a snippet of Aurora demonstrating a contemporary routine. The video didn't capture Kruger's mocking or the forced nature of the event. Instead, it painted Aurora as a hidden gem in the company, a janitor-turned-star dancer. The short clip went viral within certain circles, especially among employees of Martin and Kruger. The comments were a barrage of admiration, jokes, and speculation. Some viewers questioned why a talented dancer would be working as a janitor. Others made borderline offensive remarks about mail-order brides and exotic performers. It stung. Because of the buzz, the company's PR team felt compelled to address the video in an official capacity. Rather than condemning the exploitative circumstances behind it, they saw it as a marketing opportunity. Suddenly, Aurora received an email from a corporate communications manager, praising her for embodying the inclusive spirit of Martin and Kruger and requesting a brief interview for the company's internal newsletter. Aurora bristled, feeling the entire situation slip further out of her control. She tried to decline, but the manager insisted it would be a short interview, just a few questions about her background and her love of dance, to be posted on the company's intranet for employees. Not wanting to rock the boat or attract negative consequences, Aurora reluctantly agreed. She found herself in a small conference room a few days later, facing a PR specialist armed with a digital recorder and a list of questions. "So Aurora, you've become something of a celebrity around here. How does it feel?" the PR woman asked with a bright, toothy grin. Aurora forced a polite smile. "I'm surprised by the attention," she answered truthfully. "I never expected that a personal hobby like dancing would cause such a stir." "That's wonderful," the woman replied with a nod, jotting notes. "So you're from the Philippines originally. How long have you been in the US?" 4 years, Aurora said. She thought of her family, of her father who had passed away not long after she left Manila. She wished she could talk about how dancing was her last precious link to him, but she doubted that nuance was what the company wanted. The PR woman nodded enthusiastically. "And you learned to dance back home?" "Yes," Aurora said. "My father was a dance instructor, so I grew up around it. I also studied a bit of ballet and contemporary styles in local workshops." "Fascinating," the woman said, leaning forward. So tell us, how do you feel working here at Martin and Kruger, where these kinds of hidden talents can be celebrated? Aurora inhaled, carefully measuring her words. I'm grateful for the job that allows me to support my family, she said. But I think there's a difference between being recognized for something you love and feeling compelled to showcase it in ways you might not choose on your own. A brief pause fell. The PR woman glanced at Aurora, uncertain. Could you clarify what you mean by compelled? Aurora hesitated, her heart pounding. Part of her wanted to speak out about the humiliating nature of that first performance in the CEO's office, about how powerless she felt. But fear swelled within her. She recalled the precariousness of her visa and how easily Kruger could uproot her life. She gave a tight smile. I just mean that sometimes it can be surprising, and I wish I had a bit more control over how I share this part of myself. The PR woman nodded slowly, scribbling something in her notepad. Aurora knew that comment would likely be watered down or omitted from the final write-up. The interview wrapped up shortly afterward, with polite thanks and promises to notify her when the newsletter was published. Days went by and Aurora managed to slip back into her routine. She continued cleaning, sending money home, and doing her best to avoid Kruger's gaze. But the tension in the office soared. Another corporate event was on the horizon, an annual investor conference scheduled for the following week. The rumor was that Kruger planned to do something spectacular to impress the major shareholders, especially the new European partners. Whispers circulated that Aurora might be asked or forced to dance again. Some people even speculated she'd be put on stage in a flashy costume to dazzle the onlookers. The entire building buzzed with speculation. Meanwhile, Aurora dreaded the approach of the conference. She felt the old nightmares returning, the anxious dreams of being on a stage where everyone laughed at her, of being thrown back to Manila without a job, without savings. One morning, as she mopped the hallway outside Kruger's office, a passing executive said, "Better practice your moves, Aurora. The boss is counting on you to wow the crowd next week." Her blood turned cold. That evening, after finishing her shift, Aurora lingered in the building's basement level, which housed old storage rooms in the facility's break area. Most other staff had left. She quietly unlocked the door to a large, unused multi-purpose room lined with mirrors. She'd stumbled upon it by accident weeks prior. The fluorescent lights flickered to life as she stepped in. It was dusty, but it had enough open space for her to move freely. If William Kruger was going to insist on humiliating her again, she at least wanted to be prepared. And if by some small chance she could bring genuine artistry to the stage, maybe it wouldn't feel so utterly degrading. She plugged her phone into a portable speaker, letting a soft instrumental piece fill the air. She closed her eyes and began to stretch, the tension in her muscles slowly unwinding. For the next hour, Aurora danced, starting with gentle warm-ups, then moving into contemporary routines, weaving in her father's folk choreography. She allowed the music to carry her to a place where no mocking eyes existed, where the solitary roar of her own heartbeat merged with the beat of the music, and every movement was an expression of buried grief, longing, and stubborn hope. Just as she concluded a particularly fluid spin, she heard the door click open. She froze, heart hammering. Standing in the doorway was Dr. Helmut Fischer. He carried a slim briefcase and wore a concerned expression. "I'm sorry," he said in his light accent, stepping inside. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I was working late and heard music. I got curious." Aurora clenched her jaw, uncertain whether to feel embarrassed or relieved. "It's okay," she said, stepping back from the mirrored wall. "I was just practicing." Dr. Fisher nodded, setting his briefcase down. "I see that, and may I say you're quite remarkable." He paused, then added quietly, "I realize how uncomfortable these forced performances must be for you. It's not appropriate in my opinion." Aurora felt a lump form in her throat. The sudden surge of emotion nearly overwhelmed her, but she took a steadying breath. "Thank you," she managed. "No one else in your position has said anything like that." He exhaled heavily, running a hand through his neat hair. "Kruger doesn't quite realize or doesn't care about the effect he's having on people. I came here expecting a straightforward merger, synergy, and all that, but these displays," he shook his head, "they're not what I signed up for." Aurora studied him carefully, wary of whether he might be another manipulator, but his eyes held a genuine concern. She decided to take a risk. "Dr. Fisher," she said, "why do you think Mr. Kruger is doing all of this? Why me?" He sighed. "William loves power. He thrives on controlling situations. With the merger, he's aiming to show the European board that he has everything and everyone in the palm of his hand. He thinks these little spectacles exhibit a fun and inclusive corporate culture, but in reality, it's all about him. You're a captivating performer, Aurora, and you happen to be in a subordinate position. You're the perfect candidate for him to exploit as a novelty." There was a moment of silence, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Aurora finally asked, "Is there any way out of this? I can't afford to lose my job, but I can't keep doing this forever. I feel like I'm losing my self-respect." Dr. Fisher cast a quick glance at the door as though worried someone might overhear. "I don't have a ready solution," he admitted, But I won't remain complicit. I can't guarantee a swift resolution, but I promise you, if Kruger pushes this too far, I'll stand up for you. My position might have some influence if it comes to that. Aurora let out a shaky breath. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something, someone who might champion her if the need arose. Thank you, she whispered. Dr. Fisher picked up his briefcase again and offered a tight, reassuring smile. Keep practicing your dance, Aurora, but do it for yourself, not for him. With that, he left the room, leaving Aurora alone with her racing thoughts. She stood there for a long time, uncertain whether to cry from relief at finding an ally or despair at how powerless she still was. The next few days promised no small measure of anxiety as the investor conference loomed on the horizon. She could practically feel the entire building bracing for a performance. Was she doomed to serve as the dancing jester to a tyrant's court, or would there come a moment when her moves wouldn't just appease the boss but shake him to his core, make him see that she was more than a cheap trick, more than a powerless pawn in his corporate game? As Aurora flicked off the lights and walked out of the multipurpose room, she had no idea just how transformative and dangerous the upcoming event would be, nor did she realize that her dancing wouldn't be the only thing to take center stage. A storm brewed beneath the polished surface of Martin and Kruger International, one that would test loyalties, expose buried secrets, and perhaps change everything. Aurora's nerves frayed with each passing day leading up to the grand investor conference. She spent every spare moment in that hidden multipurpose room in the basement, dancing to quell her anxiety. Even if this performance turned out to be another humiliating spectacle, she resolved to make it as true to herself as possible. Yet in the back of her mind lingered the recent conversation with Dr. Helmut Fischer, whose quiet promise of support offered a faint gleam of hope. Whether or not he could truly protect her from William Kruger's manipulations remained to be seen. On the morning of the conference, the entire Martin and Kruger International building buzzed with heightened activity. Security teams bustled in and out of the lobby. Caterers with immaculate trays of hors d'oeuvres circled the halls. Important guests arrived in sleek black cars that lined the curb outside. A swirl of elegantly dressed executives milled about, checking schedules, adjusting ties, and ensuring everything would run smoothly for the day's presentations. Aurora found it impossible to focus on her usual cleaning duties. She tried not to draw attention to herself, but the staff lounge was rife with gossip, some of it delivered in hushed tones that suggested something major was about to unfold. They say the board members from Europe arrived last night, one custodian mentioned. Yeah, and I heard Kruger's planning some big theatrical announcement, bigger than anything he's done before, another commented, rolling his eyes. Each snippet of conversation set Aurora's heart pounding faster. She had received no direct instructions yet, no official request from Kruger to perform, but it was almost impossible to believe he wouldn't use her as part of his show. Just after noon, Aurora finished wiping down the conference room tables on one of the lower floors. As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. They want you at the VIP lounge on the 52nd floor in 15 minutes. Denise. Aurora's stomach churned. Denise, her direct supervisor, must have been told to convey this. With a shaky breath, she packed up her supplies and headed upstairs. When the elevator doors parted on the 52nd floor, Aurora stepped onto a swath of plush carpet leading to a pair of towering double doors that opened into the VIP lounge. She could hear the hum of conversation, the clink of glassware, and see the swirl of expensive suits and dresses. Carefully, she slipped in through a side door, trying not to be noticed, but she barely had time to survey the room before a dark-suited assistant seized her elbow and guided her swiftly toward a corner. "You're Aurora, right? The one from facilities?" he asked in a clipped tone, eyes darting about for any sign of the CEO. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "Good, Mr. Kruger wants you in the staging area behind the banquet hall. Move quickly, he's expecting you." The assistant thrust a small envelope into her hand, then turned away without waiting for a response, merging back into the crowd of business elites. Aurora's fingers shook as she opened the envelope. Inside was a simple directive typed in cold. "Be ready to perform a dance sequence at exactly 2:45 p.m. The music will be provided. You will stand at the left side of the stage until announced. Follow my lead. WK." She stared at the message, her heart hammering. No mention of an option to refuse, no sense of courtesy, just a command. As if her very humanity was secondary to Kruger's whims. She forced herself to breathe, remembering Dr. Fisher's soft reassurance. If this was the plan, at least she would try to dance with dignity, and hold out hope that Fisher might intervene if matters went too far. She slipped through a side corridor leading to the main banquet hall, which was abuzz with final preparations. Technicians adjusted stage lights and tested microphone levels. Several large screens displayed the Martin and Kruger International logo alongside the brand of the newly acquired European robotics firm. At the back of the stage, lavish floral arrangements framed the podium where Kruger would soon speak. Rows upon rows of seats fanned out, enough to accommodate hundreds of investors, stakeholders, and high-ranking employees. Aurora spotted Dr. Fisher near one of the screens, quietly chatting with a few Europeans in tailored suits. He caught sight of her, gave a slight nod, but didn't approach. She read tension in his features. She found a spot backstage and hovered there, the typed note still clenched in her hand. Soon, William Kruger appeared, flanked by his usual entourage of well-dressed executives. The group bustled backstage, double-checking schedules and exchanging last-minute details. Kruger's commanding presence dominated the area as he strode around, chest puffed out, making sure everything was perfect. Noticing Aurora, he approached with an unsettling glimmer in his eye. "Aurora," he greeted her, voice artificially warm. "We're about to begin, so you'll wait in the wings. When I signal, you'll step out onto the stage. We have a nice up-tempo piece for you to dance to. I expect you to give it your all, make it lively, exciting. These are our most important investors." Aurora swallowed hard, her pulse racing. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. Kruger patted her shoulder with patronizing confidence. "Good girl, and if you do well, we might discuss your future here." There was a loaded undertone in his words, a threat of sorts, a promise of potential rewards or punishments depending on her compliance. Aurora bit her lip to stifle her rising anger. The arrogance in his eyes reminded her of the humiliations she had endured these past weeks, the after-hours dance in his office, the forced demonstration in front of the managers. Memories of her father's voice steadied her. She inhaled, knowing that no matter how she was used as a spectacle, at least the dance itself was hers, a gift she'd honed since childhood. A few moments later, the lights throughout the banquet hall dimmed slightly. Soft, dramatic music played as a confident voice introduced William Kruger to the podium. The overhead lights revealed a sea of expensive suits and glittering evening gowns. Aurora peered from behind the curtain, seeing hundreds of powerful figures fixated on the stage. The hush of anticipation blanketed the hall. Kruger stepped forward, arms spread wide in a charismatic show of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished investors and our esteemed partners from Europe, I welcome you all to our annual investor conference, the first since finalizing the merger with Dr. Fisher's illustrious firm. Today, we stand on the precipice of groundbreaking innovation, synergy, and profitability." Polite applause filled the room. Dr. Fisher and a few of his European colleagues sat in the front row, their expressions reserved. Kruger continued, waxing poetic about synergy, integration, and the unstoppable growth he anticipated. His oratory skills had always been formidable, painting grand visions of the future and weaving in corporate jargon about leveraging cross-platform technologies and enhancing global market share. Aurora watched from the wings, shifting from foot to foot, dreading the moment she'd be summoned. She noticed Dr. Fisher tapping a pen restlessly on his knee as though anxious. "Now," Kruger's voice rose, taking on a showman's tone, "I'd like to provide you with a vivid example of the Martin and Kruger culture, a culture in which we celebrate the hidden talents and passions within our organization. Because innovation isn't just about new technologies, ladies and gentlemen, it's about unleashing the full potential of our people. Let me introduce you to someone who might surprise you." The overhead lights shifted, a narrow spotlight hitting Aurora's side of the stage. Her heart plummeted. She knew this was her cue. She braced herself, stepping out into the glare. Applause trickled awkwardly from the massive audience, uncertain about who she was or what to expect. "This is Aurora Madrigal," Kruger announced, extending a hand. "She joined us some months ago in a janitorial role, but as you'll see, she is so much more than that. Aurora, why don't you show our investors what you've got?" The lights around Aurora brightened. She stood rigidly, blinking at the sea of faces. For a split second, panic nearly paralyzed her. Public speaking had never been her forte, and though dancing came naturally, the context of being displayed like an oddity made her feel nauseated. Yet the music started, a lively fusion of pop and electronic beats that reverberated through the sound system. She had no choice. She closed her eyes and let the music sink into her limbs. She drew a breath, stepped forward, and began to move. The routine that she'd practiced in the basement was more contemporary in style, with fluid transitions and occasional bursts of sharp rhythm. She didn't hold back, pouring her frustration, her dignity, her entire soul into each motion. The crowd's initial murmurs of confusion shifted to quiet captivation. Something about the authenticity of her movements, maybe the mix of vulnerability and resolute pride, held them transfixed. Her arms swept wide, her feet glided across the stage, and every step spoke the language of a person refusing to be cowed. She spun once, twice, letting the momentum carry her in a graceful arc, then paused in a poised stance at center stage, raising her gaze to the auditorium. For a moment, all she heard was her heartbeat pounding in time with the music, and the memory of her father's laughter when she was a child, how he'd clap joyously after she perfected a new step. The music ended on a vibrant chord. Aurora held her final pose, chest heaving, perspiration beading on her forehead. The stage lights glistened off the faint sheen of sweat on her arms. A hush gripped the audience for a fraction of a second, one suspended moment that felt like forever. Then thunderous applause erupted, echoing through the hall. People stood, some whistling or cheering. Even the jaded investors seemed genuinely impressed. Aurora blinked, stunned by the response. She turned her head slightly to see Dr. Fisher standing up in the front row, clapping emphatically. Some of the other Europeans followed suit, and soon the entire hall was awash in applause. This was the first time she danced freely in a long while, forced by circumstance, yet ultimately letting her passion shine through. Kruger strode back to the podium with a triumphant smile, soaking in the adulation as if it were directed at him. Magnificent, wasn't it? Another testament to how Martin and Kruger fosters talent at every level. He gestured for Aurora to stand next to him. She reluctantly approached, still catching her breath. He clapped a hand on her shoulder. A hidden gem in our midst. Now that's the spirit of innovation. It goes to show that in our corporate family, we want everyone to bring their best, whether in the boardroom or on the stage. Let's have another round of applause for Aurora Madrigal. The audience applauded once more, but now Aurora noticed something. Kruger's grin held a certain contrived air. Perhaps he was thrown off by the genuine passion Aurora had just displayed. Instead of a comedic sideshow, she had delivered a performance that commanded respect. For a moment, he seemed uncertain how to proceed, a glimmer of discomfort in his eyes. Yet he quickly regained composure. "Thank you, Aurora, you may step backstage now," he said, dismissing her with a flourish of his hand. Aurora offered a slight bow, though she burned inwardly at his casual arrogance. The applause died down, replaced by the rustling of programs and resumed conversation. She darted back to the curtain, heart still racing. As she slipped backstage, she exhaled in relief. The worst was over. The performance had garnered applause rather than ridicule. Perhaps she could slip away now, avoid further humiliation. But a crowd of executives and staff, enthralled by her dancing, approached to congratulate her, some offering handshakes or marveling at her skill. They showered her with praise, and though it felt good to be recognized, she remained on guard, aware that it was Kruger who wielded real power here. Eventually, the banquet program continued with Dr. Fisher's presentation about the robotics division. Aurora lingered near the backstage area, not sure if she was dismissed entirely or expected to remain. That's when Kruger himself appeared behind the curtain, scanning for her. As soon as their eyes met, he beckoned her over. "Aurora," he said quietly, a veneer of politeness barely covering an undercurrent of tension. "Great job up there. That dance was quite impressive, maybe a bit more than I anticipated, but that's fine." He leaned in. "I need you to do one more piece after Fisher wraps up, something with even more energy to close out the session on a high note. Keep them talking, you know." She stiffened. "Another dance, sir?" He shrugged. "Is that a problem?" A cold challenge gleamed in his gaze. She thought of her visa, of the job she so desperately needed, of the money she had to send home. "No, sir," she said at last, though every fiber of her being revolted at his brazen assumption she would simply comply. Kruger's lip curled in a self-satisfied smirk. "Fantastic, wait here, we'll call you back on stage when Dr. Fisher finishes." With that, he stepped away, disappearing among the stage crew. Aurora's chest felt tight. She didn't have more choreography prepared. She'd poured everything into that single performance. But apparently it wasn't enough for Kruger. She stepped over to a quiet corner backstage and stretched out her limbs, trying to calm her thoughts. Meanwhile, Dr. Fisher's voice carried from the podium, describing in detail the breakthroughs in robotics and AI their merged companies would soon unveil. At last, Dr. Fisher concluded to respectable applause. Aurora peered through a gap in the curtain, expecting Kruger to come back up. Instead, to her surprise, Dr. Fisher remained at the podium a moment longer. He cleared his throat, looking over the audience with thoughtful eyes. "Before I leave the stage," he said, "I'd like to offer a different perspective on what we witnessed earlier. Aurora's dance was no mere show. It was an expression of her heritage and her personal passion. In many corporate cultures, employees rarely get to reveal their full selves. We should applaud this not just for entertainment, but for the deeper message it carries. Each person here has a story, a background, a set of gifts that extend beyond the confines of their job description." Kruger, who had been heading to the stage steps, froze. The crowd listened quietly. Aurora caught her breath. Dr. Fisher glanced toward the side of the stage, and she realized he was looking at her, even if he couldn't see her face. "This is what it truly means to be an inclusive organization," he continued. "It's not about forced displays or token acknowledgments. It's about genuine respect for every individual's potential. So, Aurora, if you're still backstage, I want to personally thank you for reminding us that being human is our greatest strength." Dr. Fisher stepped away from the podium to a burst of applause. Aurora's heart lifted in cautious hope. His words felt like an affirmation, a subtle stand against Kruger's manipulative showmanship. But as the applause died, Kruger took the stage again, wearing a tight-lipped grin that suggested he was not entirely pleased by Fisher's impromptu commentary. Kruger forced a jovial tone. "Well said, Dr. Fisher, well said indeed. Now let's wrap this conference on a high note, literally. Aurora, please come out once more. We can't let you slip away without giving us one more taste of those moves." The spotlight swung to the left side of the stage. Aurora inhaled, bracing herself. She stepped out, a polite smile on her face that belied her inner turmoil. The staff near the control panel started the second track Kruger had selected, a brassy pop piece with a driving beat. Aurora lifted her arms, trying to find the rhythm, but something felt off. This song was bombastic and gaudy, more akin to a dance club anthem. She attempted a few steps, letting muscle memory take over, though it clashed with her preference for elegant storytelling choreography. She noticed the audience's mild confusion. They'd expected something as graceful and heartfelt as her first performance. Halfway through the routine, her frustration peaked. She glanced toward Dr. Fisher, seated in the front row, and saw the empathy in his gaze. Another burst of movement came from her body, but it lacked the authenticity she'd shown before. Instead of exuding her usual fluid grace, she felt stiff, trapped in a forced spectacle. A few investors still clapped along, but the energy in the room had shifted. Then Kruger, who apparently wanted to amp up the excitement, strode right onto the stage. He gestured for Aurora to move aside as if he were about to join or direct her. "Come on, let's get a little more spark in this," he said into the microphone. Some audience members chuckled, thinking it a harmless bit of fun, but Aurora sensed the subtle threat in his stance. This wasn't about partnership or celebration. It was about controlling the stage, controlling her. He reached for her hand, trying to whirl her around as though in some half-baked attempt at salsa or swing. His touch made her skin crawl. She maintained a professional facade, completing a quick spin, but the forced intimacy made her face flush with discomfort. The audience tittered, uncertain whether to find the moment humorous or cringe-inducing. "That's it," Kruger crowed. "Show them how it's done." He stepped in front of her, arms raised above his head, encouraging the crowd to clap. But in his drunken performance of confidence, he stumbled over Aurora's foot. She tried to catch him before he toppled, but the microphone in his hand fell to the floor with a loud thud, sending feedback screeching across the sound system. Kruger nearly lost his balance, flailing awkwardly. A few people laughed outright, others gasped. The smug composure of the CEO cracked like an egg on stage. Fury flashed across Kruger's face. He picked up the microphone, turning on Aurora with a venomous glare. She froze, feeling a sudden dread coil in her stomach. He forced a laugh, speaking into the mic. "Well, it seems I've proven dancing is exactly my strong suit. Let's leave it to the professionals, or at least to those who have been practicing in secret while on the company's time." He aimed a pointed, mocking look at Aurora. A hush took the room. Dr. Fisher slowly rose from his seat, brow furrowed. Several board members looked at one another in confusion, trying to discern if Kruger was joking or leveling an accusation. Aurora's heart pounded. She could practically hear the implied threat that she'd been wasting company resources if she practiced dancing in the building. In that split second, she made a decision that would alter the course of the evening and her life at Martin and Kruger. She grabbed hold of the microphone, her fingers trembling, and fixed Kruger with steady eyes. A lifetime's worth of swallowed pride, humiliation, and frustration welled up inside her. "Sir," she said, voice quavering slightly, "I haven't used the company's time for my practice. I come in early or I stay late, and I never neglect my duties. Everything I do, my work, my dance, it's for my family, for my future. I respect this company and the people here, but dancing is my passion, my heritage, and I refuse to let it be trivialized as a party trick." A few audible gasps emanated from the crowd. Kruger looked both shocked and enraged that she had the gall to speak out. He tried to yank the microphone away, but Aurora held it tighter, swallowing the fear that threatened to paralyze her. "I appreciate that some of you enjoyed my dancing," she continued, her voice growing firmer, "but I never wanted to be forced into it as entertainment for those who see me as less than an equal. Dancing is my art, and I share it with dignity, not because my boss demands it." With that, she let the microphone slip from her grasp, the thud echoing in the stunned silence. Her entire body shook, but a liberated sense of relief coursed through her. She had spoken her truth, consequences be damned. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Dr. Fisher stepped forward, climbing onto the stage. His expression was resolute. He picked up the microphone. "Aurora is right," he said, voice measured, "and I think it's time we acknowledge the line between celebrating an employee's talents and exploiting them." He shifted his attention to Kruger. "William, we never discussed forcing staff to perform. I certainly don't recall approving any spectacle that would humiliate a member of our team. Is this the culture we want to champion?" Kruger glared daggers at Dr. Fisher, struggling to maintain composure. The tension was thick enough to slice with a knife. "I don't believe this is the place for such a discussion," he said icily, trying to corral the situation. "This is an investor conference, not a staff meeting. We can handle this internally later." But Dr. Fisher seemed unwilling to let the moment pass. Instead, he looked out at the shareholders and board members. "I disagree. The culture we create directly affects the company's reputation and performance. If we treat our employees with contempt or coercion, we undermine the very principles that drive innovation and trust." Several of the European board members nodded or whispered among themselves, apparently sharing Fisher's viewpoint. Some of Martin and Kruger's own board members also seemed unsettled, as though they recognized they could no longer turn a blind eye to Kruger's overreaches. Kruger tried to laugh it off, but the sound rang hollow. Let's not blow a minor misunderstanding out of proportion. He shot Aurora a warning glance, then attempted to address the crowd more cheerfully. It's all in good fun, folks. I'm sure Aurora understands that no offense was intended. Aurora remained silent, her head held high. She had no interest in smoothing over the CEO's narrative. The tension in the room escalated until an older board member with silver hair and a crisp navy suit stood from his seat. He tapped his cane on the floor for attention. Mr. Kruger, in light of this display, perhaps we should evaluate how we're presenting our corporate culture. We've received glowing reports of Aurora's diligence, and her dancing ability is indeed remarkable, but if she feels coerced, we have a serious morale and ethics issue on our hands. The last thing this company needs is a scandal or rumors about employee mistreatment. Kruger's face went pale, though he struggled to mask it with a polite nod. Of course, we'll address any grievances immediately. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Langdon. He forced a smile at the audience, which now buzzed with uneasy chatter. Let us conclude this segment. We've had enough excitement for one afternoon. He offered a tight gesture of dismissal, and the overhead lights shifted, signaling a break. As the audience dispersed for refreshments, Kruger turned to Aurora. His expression was a thunderstorm of barely contained anger. You, he hissed, stay right here until we can discuss this privately. Dr. Fisher stepped closer, placing a hand on Aurora's shoulder. I think we should all discuss this in a more appropriate setting, William, along with HR and a few other board members, he said calmly. For a split second, Aurora feared Kruger might lash out physically, so intense was the fury in his eyes. Instead, he merely pivoted on his heel and stormed off the stage, beckoning a cluster of executives to follow. Dr. Fisher gave Aurora a reassuring nod and guided her backstage, away from the murmuring spectators. They ended up in a smaller adjacent conference room, accompanied by 2 senior board members and a representative from HR who had hurried to the scene after seeing the commotion. Kruger paced by the window, trying to collect himself. Aurora sat quietly on a leather chair, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Dr. Fisher broke the silence. We need to address what just happened. Aurora, you've made it clear you felt coerced into dancing for corporate events. Is that correct? She swallowed, nodding. Yes, it started that night in Mr. Kruger's office with a group of executives. I was told to dance in front of them as a novelty. I didn't feel I could refuse without risking my job. Then came the auditorium demonstration and now this investor conference. Each time I had no real choice. One of the board members, a stern-looking woman named Evelyn Pierce, frowned. Mr. Kruger, is this accurate? Did you make Aurora perform against her will? Kruger spun around, frustration radiating from him. I never forced her per se. I only gave her opportunities to showcase her talents. I wanted to celebrate her. She was never threatened or penalized for declining. Aurora's eyes stung with tears of anger. That's not entirely true, she said, voice soft but steady. Every time you made it clear that my job security depended on my compliance, and you teased me in front of everyone. You call that celebrating? It was humiliating. Kruger's hands balled into fists at his sides. He was clearly unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by a low-level employee. His gaze swept the room, noting how the others observed him warily. Realizing that anger alone wouldn't help him, he tried a different angle. His tone softened, as if attempting contrition. Listen, Aurora, if I came across as overbearing, I apologize. I truly am sorry you felt humiliated. My intent was never to degrade you. He forced a smile, but his eyes were flat. Perhaps I got carried away with the idea of showing your talent to others. If you want, I can grant you some compensation, a bonus for your trouble. An awkward silence followed. Aurora saw how the board members stiffened. They realized Kruger was trying to buy his way out of accountability. She mustered courage and spoke again, though her voice trembled. I don't want hush money, Mr. Kruger. I only want respect, and to ensure no other employee is subjected to this kind of treatment. That's what matters. To Aurora's surprise, Evelyn Pierce nodded in agreement. Dr. Fisher remained composed, but Aurora caught the faintest of smiles at the corner of his mouth, as if proud of her stance. The HR representative finally cleared his throat, glancing from Kruger to Aurora. I think the best course of action here is to conduct a formal review. We'll speak to all parties involved, gather testimony, and ensure fair treatment. We certainly don't want any employee feeling coerced. Kruger, sensing the seriousness of the situation, forced a more compliant expression. Of course, a formal review, let's do what's necessary, he said, though the tension in his voice betrayed how he truly felt. But might I suggest we keep this matter internal? Our company reputation is paramount, especially with the merger so fresh. Dr. Fisher stepped in. Reputation is critical, William, but so is integrity. If we prioritize external appearances at the expense of employees' well-being, we risk rotting from within. His tone was measured, leaving little room for argument. Evelyn Pierce looked from Kruger to Fisher and finally to Aurora. "We'll handle this swiftly but thoroughly. For now, Ms. Madrigal, you're free to go. You'll be contacted for an official statement soon. If you feel any retaliation or if your employment is threatened in any way, please report it directly to HR or to me. Understood?" Aurora nodded, tears threatening to spill as relief mixed with anxiety. "Thank you," she said. Kruger's gaze remained cold as she rose to leave, and an uneasy sense of finality weighed in the air. Dr. Fisher walked her out into the corridor, where they paused near a large window overlooking the city. "I'm proud of you for speaking up," he murmured. "It took courage." Aurora managed a shaky smile. "I just hope I didn't seal my own termination or start a storm I can't weather." Fisher exhaled. "Look, Kruger has his pride, but the board is becoming more aware of his behavior. I suspect this could mark the start of changes within the company, though it won't happen overnight. In the meantime, I'll do everything in my power to ensure you're protected. That's a promise." With that reassurance, Aurora slipped away. She grabbed her belongings from her locker and fled the building before the investor conference concluded, not wanting to linger for any further spectacle. Days turned into a week. A hush settled over her interactions at Martin and Kruger. She kept to her routine, diligently cleaning offices, avoiding Kruger's floor whenever possible. Oddly, rumors about the incident at the conference circulated in hushed, perplexed tones. Some employees speculated that Aurora had shamed Kruger publicly. Others heard whispers that top board members were launching an internal probe into workplace conduct. Aurora was called into an HR office to provide an official account of her experiences. She recounted each instance of coercion and belittlement, nomming the witnesses present. The HR representative took notes, maintained professional neutrality, and promised her that steps were being taken. A few days later, Dr. Fisher found her again in the basement multi-purpose room, where she was quietly practicing a fluid contemporary piece. His dress shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, and the lines of fatigue on his face suggested many tense meetings and negotiations behind the scenes. "I have some news," he said, stepping into the space. "The board has reviewed your case. There was enough evidence, emails, eyewitness accounts, and so forth to demonstrate that Mr. Kruger crossed the line of professional conduct. The outcome is complicated. He'll stay on as CEO for now because he's got significant power, shares, and alliances. But the board has mandated corrective measures, including an official apology to you and sensitivity training for the entire executive leadership. HR has also been given broader oversight to prevent future abuses of authority." Aurora paused, her stretching, her heart fluttering. An official apology from Mr. Kruger himself. Fisher nodded. He might not be thrilled, but yes, that's what they've decided. Furthermore, you'll be given the option to transfer out of janitorial duties if you wish, possibly into a role aligned with your interests. The board thinks it might be wise to give you more opportunities in the company, considering your skill set and the positive publicity from that first dance video, which ironically has spread beyond the company intranet. Some local performing arts groups are praising you online. Aurora's lips parted in surprise. I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever expected. Are you sure?" Fisher gave a gentle shrug. "It's the board's decision, with a push from me and a few others who believe in your potential. At the very least, it's an opportunity to step away from the situation that's caused you so much distress. Or you can remain in facilities if that's your preference. No pressure, truly. We just wanted you to have options." Her mind spun with possibilities. A new position, perhaps in the events department, or even something that allowed her time to audition for dance shows in the city. She'd never have dared dream it possible. Yet a lingering doubt kept her from feeling too elated. Kruger's influence hadn't evaporated. He was still CEO, still powerful. This apology might be nothing more than a superficial act for show. She needed to see if genuine change could happen or if it was all a smokescreen. A few days later, a modest gathering took place in a quiet conference room on the executive floor. Aurora, Dr. Fisher, Evelyn Pierce from the board, the HR representative, and William Kruger himself. The CEO stood near a polished wooden table, arms crossed, jaw set. The tension in his eyes suggested he despised every second of this ordeal, yet the board mandate compelled him to comply. Aurora braced herself, not sure what to expect. Evelyn Pierce cleared her throat. "Mr. Kruger, you have a statement to deliver." Kruger looked at Aurora, chin raised, as though addressing a subordinate who'd caused him endless headaches. He spoke in a clipped tone, but his words were carefully measured. "Aurora, I acknowledge that my methods in encouraging you to dance for corporate events placed undue pressure on you, and I failed to respect proper professional boundaries. For that, I apologize. It was never my intent to make you feel demeaned or coerced." Aurora's pulse fluttered with anxiety. She could see how the words nearly caught in his throat. He clearly hated this. And while the apology sounded formal rather than heartfelt, it was still a remarkable moment. A billionaire CEO forced to back down to a janitor. The power of truth and company oversight had prevailed, at least to some extent. "Thank you," Aurora said softly, choosing her words with care. "I accept your apology. I hope we can all move forward in a way that respects every person in this company." Evelyn Pierce gave a satisfied nod, scribbling a final note on her clipboard. "Very well, I believe this concludes the matter. Aurora, HR will finalize details for your potential transfer. Mr. Kruger, we appreciate your compliance. Let's all aim to restore a sense of harmony here." Kruger offered a tight smile, then turned on his heel and left the room. The tension he radiated lingered in the space even after he vanished. Evelyn and the HR representative soon followed, leaving only Aurora and Dr. Fisher behind. The weight of the confrontation seemed to lift, replaced by a cautious hope. Dr. Fisher patted her shoulder gently before walking her out. In the weeks that followed, Aurora noticed subtle shifts around the office. A new company-wide memo emphasized respect and non-discrimination, along with clear guidelines for reporting harassment or coercion. Rumor had it that Kruger was under close watch by the board. One more major infraction and they might force him out, no matter how many shares he owned. Some employees expressed relief that someone had finally stood up to him. Others remained too fearful to be openly critical, but at least a spark had been lit. The once intimidating aura around Kruger had been punctured. Meanwhile, Aurora's own life took a surprising turn. True to the board's word, she was offered a choice of positions. One was a junior administrative role in the events department, which would involve helping organize company functions and external conferences. Another was a position in the corporate social responsibility (CSR) team, coordinating volunteer and cultural programs that reached out to local communities. Both opportunities were far beyond her initial station as a night shift janitor. After careful deliberation, she chose the CSR role, partly because it resonated with her desire to help others and share her cultural heritage in a more genuine, empowering way. She also reconnected with her passion for dance outside the corporate environment. The short viral video that circulated had piqued the interest of a small local dance company, which invited her to audition. She went to their studio in Queens one weekend, nervous but determined. The audition panel watched her with growing admiration. 2 days later, she received an email offering her a part-time slot in their upcoming production, an experimental contemporary piece that would rehearse in the evenings. She could keep her new corporate role while pursuing the dream she thought she had lost forever. On a crisp morning, just as she was about to start her first official day in CSR, Aurora found herself walking down the same corridor where this all began. The marble floors gleamed under the bright overhead lights. She paused outside the office that once intimidated her, the corner suite belonging to William Kruger. The door was shut, blinds drawn, giving the impression of a fortress under siege. She remembered how terrified she used to be merely passing by it. A wave of memories rolled through her, cleaning the floors at night, hearing the roar of executives laughing, being singled out to dance as a joke, the humiliating feeling of being seen as a novelty, and finally standing on stage to declare that she wasn't merely an object to be trotted out. An emotional swirl threatened to overwhelm her, but she steadied herself. She had survived it. She had, in her own way, won. She was about to move on when the office door opened. Out stepped Kruger himself, sifting through some paperwork. He glanced up, meeting her gaze. For a brief moment, they simply looked at each other. In that moment, she saw cracks in his usual facade, the subdued posture, the faint circles under his eyes. This man, who had once wielded unassailable authority, now carried a hint of uncertainty. Perhaps some portion of him recognized he'd gone too far, or maybe he was simply unnerved by the board's restrictions. Whatever the case, Aurora sensed he wouldn't easily forget the lesson gleaned from their conflict. He gave a curt nod, some semblance of acknowledgement, then continued down the hallway without a word. She did the same, turning the opposite direction, feeling no need to speak. There was nothing left to say. Their unspoken exchange carried enough weight. She was no longer just a janitor at his mercy, and he would never see her as powerless again. During lunchtime, Aurora made her way to her new workstation, a modest cubicle among the CSR team. The desk had a small welcome note, a company laptop, and a binder of orientation materials. She sat down, heart fluttering with excitement and trepidation. It wasn't a dance studio, but it was a stepping stone to a better life, a place where she could use her skill set, her empathy, cultural passion, and organizational abilities to foster genuine community outreach. While sifting through the orientation binder, she smiled at a particular page describing the company's philanthropic initiatives. Perhaps she could propose a project that celebrated cultural arts, highlighting employees from diverse backgrounds. If done right, it wouldn't be exploitative but empowering. She envisioned inviting voluntary performances from staff who truly wanted to share their cultures, no forced amusements, no power plays. A legitimate platform for self-expression. Her phone chimed. It was a text from her younger sister in Manila. "Received the tuition money. Thank you so much. 8 graduation next year. Wish you could be here." Aurora typed back quickly, tears springing to her eyes. I'm proud of you. I'll see you soon, I promise. After she sent the message, she gazed around her new workplace, reflecting on how far she'd come in just a few tumultuous months. She had arrived in America with hopes of simply making ends meet, only to be thrust into a surreal battle with a billionaire CEO. And yet, through a combination of courage, support from unexpected allies like Dr. Fisher, and her own unwavering passion for dance, she had found a stronger footing in the company and in her own sense of self. That evening, Aurora stepped out of the Martin and Kruger building, the day's setting sun dipping below the skyscrapers of Manhattan. Her thoughts drifted to the upcoming dance rehearsals at the small company in Queens. She felt tired but invigorated. She was forging a path that allowed her to honor both her responsibilities and her dreams. On the sidewalk outside, she paused to watch a street performer spinning and popping to a hip-hop track. Passersby dropped coins in a hat. The performer's movements were hypnotic, echoing the freedom Aurora found whenever she danced. She gave him a few dollars and a smile, remembering how the simple power of movement had carried her through so many trials. As she continued down the bustling street, she knew challenges would always lie ahead, especially if Kruger decided to retaliate somehow. But for now, real change had begun. She was no longer an anonymous janitor living in the shadows of corporate might. She had a voice, a talent recognized on her own terms, and a future that no one could simply buy or belittle. With every step she took, Aurora felt her father's spirit dancing alongside her. She could practically hear his gentle encouragement. When you dance, dance wholeheartedly, even if your audience is only the wind. That simple truth had sustained her through exploitation and fear. It had allowed her to reclaim her dignity in the face of a tyrant's ridicule, and it would guide her forward toward whatever stage, literal or metaphorical, awaited. That night at the small studio in Queens, she stood amid a handful of dancers warming up at the bar. The director called for everyone to gather in the center. Aurora joined them, feeling an electrifying sense of belonging. Here, no one knew or cared about her battles with a ruthless CEO. They only saw a fellow dancer. The director turned on the music, an ethereal melody that began softly, building to a crescendo. Aurora inhaled, letting the gentle notes wash over her. She remembered the nights of mopping floors, the humiliating request to dance in Kruger's office, the forced spectacle at the investor conference. But she also remembered the moment she stood her ground on that stage, refusing to let her heritage or passion be reduced to a cheap thrill. With graceful determination, she eased into the choreography, aware that each movement was now truly hers. No scornful boss, no corporate charade, no sense of shame, only the art, the release, the beauty that dance had always been for her. Step by step, turn by turn, she felt a renewed hope blossoming within. In that moment, free from all constraints, Aurora realized she had indeed found her happy ending, not because life was perfect or free of struggles, but because she had reclaimed her power to define herself. And for a woman who once feared she might remain invisible, a mere cleaner in the shadows of a multinational empire, that was victory enough. The music built to its crescendo. She leapt, extended her arms in a soaring arc, and landed lightly. The hush in the studio was breathtaking. A tear slipped from her eye, not of sadness but of exhilaration. For the first time since setting foot in the United States, she truly felt she had come home, to herself, to her dreams, to a future shaped by her own hands. And somewhere in that final note, if only in spirit, she could sense William Kruger's power slipping away like smoke in the wind, replaced by the unstoppable beat of her own heart. In that resonance, Aurora's journey had found its conclusion, a testament to courage, culture, and the enduring strength of a dreamer's soul.